The courtroom was filled with a thick silence that only the shuffling of papers and the echo of footsteps could break. At the center of it all sat a man who looked far too confident for the situation he was in. Dressed in a sharp-tailored navy blue suit with his gold watch catching the light, he leaned back in his chair as if he owned not just the courtroom but the truth itself. This man, a wealthy businessman who had made his fortune through real estate and flashy deals, was here to officially end his marriage to the woman who had been by his side long before his empire existed. His wife, a composed and elegant black woman with quiet strength in her eyes, sat across the room, her hands clasped in her lap. She had come not to fight for wealth or power but for dignity, though the man across from her treated this day like a victory parade. Beside the husband, sitting smugly with painted lips and a polished smile, was his mistress. Her presence in court was not required by law but invited by arrogance. She wore an expensive red dress, her fingers intertwined with his under the table as if to stake her claim publicly. The wife's attorney had raised an eyebrow at the audacity of it all, but the husband simply smirked. He had told everyone who would listen that he was done with his wife, that he had found someone younger, more exciting, more suitable for his lifestyle. His words carried an edge of condescension whenever he spoke about the woman he once promised to love. To him, this hearing was just a formality, one last signature to erase years of shared life. Throughout their marriage, his wife had been the silent pillar of his success. When he started his first business from a one-room office, it was her savings that paid the rent. When investors turned him down, she believed in him enough to take out loans in her own name. She worked long hours, cooked, cleaned, managed bills, and endured his growing ego as his wealth rose. She had stood by him when scandals nearly ruined his reputation, covering for his mistakes, even when rumors of infidelity began to swirl. Yet, when he finally became powerful and untouchable in his mind, he decided she no longer fit his image. The same woman who had been his strength had become, in his eyes, a burden. He began flaunting his affair, bringing the mistress to events that the wife once helped organize, publicly humiliating her without shame. Now, in this courtroom, that humiliation reached its peak. The mistress smiled as the husband signed the papers, whispering in his ear as if mocking the wife's presence. The wife watched silently, her face unreadable. Those who didn't know her might have mistaken her composure for weakness, but her attorney could see the quiet fire behind her eyes. This was not a woman defeated, only one waiting for truth to take its turn. The husband leaned back, crossing his legs, pretending to be bored while the judge reviewed the documents. He whispered to the mistress again, making her giggle softly, completely unaware of the storm that was slowly building around them. The courtroom observers watched with discomfort. The wife's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the arrogance of the pair sitting opposite her. It was not just about money. It was about respect, about years of emotional betrayal being paraded in front of strangers. The husband thought he had already won because he had wealth, influence, and charm. He had no idea that his overconfidence would soon expose the rotten core of his choices. He had made sure his legal team had every financial document and every piece of evidence to make it seem like his wife deserved the bare minimum. He had hidden assets, transferred funds to fake accounts, and even manipulated records to show her as a financial dependent who contributed little. But what he didn't know was that his wife's attorney had been quietly gathering her own evidence for months. Emails, contracts, and confidential communications that told a very different story of who really built the empire he was so proud of. Every lie he thought he had buried was now sitting in a folder on the judge's desk, waiting to breathe life. As the proceedings began, the husband's lawyer spoke confidently, portraying the wife as distant, unsupportive, and unworthy of a large settlement. The mistress looked pleased, watching her rival being verbally reduced to nothing more than an afterthought. The husband nodded along, confident that the judge would see things his way. But when it came time for the wife's attorney to speak, the tone of the room shifted. The calm and steady voice began unraveling a story that made the husband's smirk falter. Bank records showing that the wife's income had paid the rent for their first office, notarized documents proving she was co-owner of his initial ventures, and correspondence showing that she had acted as an unpaid business manager for years. Each piece of evidence struck like a quiet hammer. The mistress's smile began to fade, replaced by unease as she glanced at the husband, who was now shifting uncomfortably in his seat. The judge's eyes, once indifferent, grew sharper with every page turned. Still, the husband tried to keep up appearances. He whispered excuses to his lawyer, claimed exaggerations, and muttered about misunderstandings. But the more he spoke, the deeper he sank. The judge finally raised a hand, silencing him, and turned attention back to the wife's contributions. Witnesses came forward, old friends, employees, even business partners, who testified about how much the wife had sacrificed, how she had often been the one managing crises behind closed doors while her husband played the public hero. The narrative of an unworthy wife quickly crumbled, and in its place stood the truth of a woman who had been wronged not just emotionally, but legally. Every word spoken in that courtroom peeled away the image the husband had crafted for himself. His arrogance began to show cracks as he realized the woman he had dismissed as powerless had built her case with quiet precision. The mistress sat rigid, her earlier confidence replaced by growing fear that the wealth and life she thought she was inheriting might not exist much longer. The husband looked at her, perhaps for the first time, realizing that the show of dominance he had staged might turn into a public humiliation neither of them could escape. The wife remained silent through it all, her expression calm but her presence commanding. She had endured years of lies, betrayal, and disrespect, and now, for the first time, she didn't need to speak to be heard. The truth spoke louder than any words could. The courtroom was no longer just a place for legal decisions. It had become the stage where karma began to unfold, piece by piece, against the man who thought he could buy his way out of loyalty and integrity. The moment the judge began questioning the husband's financial statements, the confident smirk that had painted his face since morning started to waver. His mistress, seated proudly beside him, adjusted her dress and crossed her legs, but even she could feel the shift in the air. The courtroom, once filled with the arrogance of money and entitlement, now seemed to breathe differently. The judge's tone grew sharper, her eyes narrowing as she went through the documents line by line. What had been presented as a simple divorce hearing was beginning to unravel into something much more serious. The husband's belief that his wealth and influence would shield him was being tested, and for the first time, he looked uncertain. The wife sat still, her gaze fixed on the judge. She didn't need to speak. Her silence carried more power than any outburst could. The judge turned the pages of the financial disclosure, her expression tightening. "These transactions," she began slowly, "don't seem to match the income reports you've submitted." The husband shifted, clearing his throat, his voice breaking slightly as he replied with forced confidence. "Your Honor, those are minor accounting adjustments, just business reallocations." But the judge wasn't buying it. She pointed out transfers made to offshore accounts, undisclosed properties, and a suspicious pattern of withdrawals made shortly before the divorce filing. Each revelation cut through his composure like a blade. His attorney tried to intervene, spinning explanations and citing standard business practice, but the judge wasn't moved. Instead, she called forward a forensic accountant, someone the wife's legal team had quietly brought in. The accountant presented a report that mapped out every concealed asset, every shell company, and every hidden transaction. It showed with undeniable precision how the husband had tried to strip the wife of what was rightfully hers. The mistress's confident posture crumbled as she listened, realizing the luxurious penthouse she had been promised was part of those concealed assets. Her eyes darted nervously toward the husband, but he avoided her gaze, his hands now trembling slightly as the courtroom watched his empire of lies collapse. The judge's questions became more direct, her tone carrying the weight of authority. "So you intentionally failed to disclose these accounts?" she asked. The husband stammered, his polished image cracking. I must have overlooked those, Your Honor." The judge's stare lingered on him, unimpressed. She knew the look of deceit when she saw it. The courtroom grew quiet again, But this time, the silence was heavy with the realization that justice was about to turn against the man who thought he owned it. The mistress, trying to remain composed, whispered something to him, but he brushed her off, his frustration showing. Then came the part that truly shattered his defense. The wife's lawyer produced copies of email correspondence between the husband and his accountant. The messages revealed discussions about how to protect his wealth before the divorce proceedings began, with specific instructions to move funds and falsify ownership documents. The judge's patience reached its limit. Her voice rose, calm but firm, as she reprimanded him for perjury and manipulation. The spectators could feel the tension, a sense of poetic justice unfolding right before their eyes. The man who had mocked his wife's dignity and paraded his mistress in court was now being stripped of the very pride that had fueled his arrogance. The mistress, who had once laughed at the wife's expense, now looked like she wanted to disappear. Her face turned pale, her confidence gone. The wife, on the other hand, remained serene, her quiet strength radiating through the courtroom. It wasn't about revenge. It was about truth finally being seen for what it was. The judge began listing the wife's contributions to the business, the initial capital she had invested, the managerial role she had played, and the emotional labor that had kept the family together during hard times. She acknowledged that the wife had been more than a spouse. She had been a partner in every sense, one whose sacrifices had made the husband's success possible. The husband tried to object, his voice desperate now, claiming that his wife had exaggerated her role. But the judge silenced him with a single raised hand. "Enough," she said firmly, her tone carrying the authority that silenced the entire room. "You've disrespected this court, your marriage, and the very foundation of fairness." Her words struck like thunder. The husband slumped slightly, his confidence replaced by a look of disbelief, as though he couldn't comprehend how his carefully constructed narrative had fallen apart so completely. The mistress tried to comfort him, placing a hand on his arm, but he jerked it away, anger flashing in his eyes. The judge continued, dissecting every attempt he had made to deceive the system. Each new revelation chipped away at his reputation. His lawyer sat beside him, visibly defeated, knowing that any appeal would crumble under the weight of evidence now on record. The once proud businessman who entered the courtroom ready to humiliate his wife now looked like a man cornered, stripped of the illusion that money could buy justice. Even the spectators began whispering, their eyes on the mistress, who sat frozen in disbelief, realizing that her presence in this courtroom had become a symbol of arrogance rather than triumph. As the hearing progressed, the judge demanded the full accounting of his assets, ordering immediate disclosure of all hidden funds. She called for the freezing of his offshore accounts and warned that further dishonesty would lead to criminal charges. The man's face turned pale. The mistress's expensive jewelry and designer bag suddenly seemed meaningless in the shadow of the judge's words. What had been planned as a public display of dominance over his wife had turned into a public reckoning. The wife's dignity, once trampled under arrogance, was being restored with every word that came from the bench. The husband's voice finally broke. "This isn't fair," he muttered, his tone trembling with anger and disbelief. "After everything I've built, you're giving it all to her?" The judge looked at him sternly and said, "No, I'm giving her what she earned, what you tried to take away." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the mistress seemed to shrink in her seat, her eyes darting to the floor. The reality that their arrogance had invited their own downfall began to settle in. The wife didn't gloat or smile. She simply lowered her gaze, a quiet tear slipping down her cheek. Not of sadness, but of release. By the time the judge finished questioning, the husband's arrogance had completely dissolved. His mistress sat motionless, no longer the symbol of his newfound freedom, but the reminder of his moral decay. The courtroom that once felt like his stage of victory had become the stage of his humiliation. Every word of evidence, every correction from the judge had exposed him not as a powerful man, but as a deceitful one who had underestimated the strength and intelligence of the woman he betrayed. The walls that once echoed his confidence now echoed only his downfall. A reminder that truth, no matter how long it takes, eventually finds its way through lies. The air inside the courtroom was thick with tension, the kind that only follows moments of exposed truth. The husband, once the picture of arrogance, now sat slouched in his chair, his face pale and drained of all confidence. His mistress avoided eye contact with everyone, the earlier gleam of pride gone from her eyes. The wife, calm and dignified, remained still, her posture unbroken as though she had known this moment would come all along. The judge adjusted her glasses, her tone steady but carrying the weight of finality as she began to deliver her verdict. There was no more argument to be made, no manipulation that could twist the facts. What had been uncovered was undeniable: deceit, fraud, and betrayal layered under years of false pretense. The courtroom had witnessed every shred of it, and now the reckoning had come. The judge began by summarizing the findings, her voice clear and measured. She acknowledged the wife's years of sacrifice, her financial and emotional contributions, and her patience in the face of public humiliation. The husband's attempts to conceal assets and manipulate the legal system had not only failed, but had revealed a pattern of dishonesty that reflected his true character. Every lie he had told to gain an advantage now stood as proof of his guilt. The mistress, seated beside him, kept her head bowed as the judge described how she had knowingly participated in public acts meant to degrade another woman. The entire courtroom could feel the weight of the judgment coming, a judgment that would serve as more than a legal decision. It would be poetic justice. When the judge finally spoke of consequences, the husband's composure shattered completely. The court ruled that the wife was entitled to half of his total assets, including the concealed properties and the business empire he had built. The accounts that had been hidden overseas were to be seized, with penalties added for his fraudulent behavior. The company he once ruled with unchecked arrogance would now bear the name of both partners, restoring the wife's rightful ownership. Gasps rippled through the spectators as the ruling was read, not because of the wealth being transferred, but because of the symbolism behind it. The woman he had publicly discarded was now recognized as the foundation of everything he owned. The husband's lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to keep him composed, but the man erupted, his voice rising in anger. "This isn't justice! She's just trying to destroy me," he shouted, slamming his hand against the table. The judge's gavel came down sharply, silencing him. Her tone cut through his fury like ice. "You destroyed yourself," she said, her eyes locked on his. "This court is simply acknowledging the truth you tried so hard to hide." The words hung heavy in the air, echoing through the silent room. The husband's outburst only deepened his humiliation. His wealth, his reputation, and his false sense of superiority had all crumbled in front of the very people he had tried to impress. The mistress, visibly shaken, tried to comfort him again, whispering something under her breath, but he pushed her hand away, his face twisted in frustration and shame. The courtroom had become a mirror, showing them the ugliness of their choices. Reporters scribbled notes, spectators murmured, and even the court officers exchanged glances. The wife sat quietly, not triumphant, but dignified, her eyes fixed ahead. She had not come to destroy anyone. She had come for justice, and she had received it in the most powerful way possible. Not through vengeance, but through truth. The judge continued, issuing a further order that struck deeper than financial loss. The husband was to pay restitution for emotional damages, recognizing the public humiliation and psychological toll inflicted on the wife. The mistress's involvement in the degradation, though not a direct party to the case, was noted in the judgment, a lasting stain on her reputation. The courtroom was silent as the judge paused, then spoke softly. "Loyalty and respect cannot be bought, and when they are betrayed, consequences follow." The words seemed to reverberate in the husband's mind, a sentence far heavier than any legal fine could ever be. The wife's attorney leaned toward her, whispering a quiet congratulations, but she only nodded faintly. She didn't smile or gloat. She simply exhaled, a slow release of years of suppressed pain. For her, this was not a victory of wealth but of worth. The husband looked at her then, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in years. Gone was the woman he had dismissed as ordinary, invisible, replaceable. What he saw now was strength. the kind that couldn't be destroyed, no matter how much power or arrogance he had tried to use against it. It was a realization that hit too late, a lesson written in shame and regret. The mistress gathered her things silently, trying to avoid the eyes of everyone in the room. The man she had believed to be powerful now looked small, broken under the weight of his own lies. The world she had imagined, the parties, the luxury, the attention, had vanished the moment the truth came out. Her role in his story had changed from the woman who replaced the wife to the woman who helped bring about his downfall. The irony was inescapable. As she looked at the wife one last time, she saw not defeat, but quiet triumph, the kind that comes from endurance, not revenge. When the judge finally rose and exited the courtroom, the echo of her footsteps was the only sound that filled the space. The bailiff announced the end of the session, and slowly people began to leave. The husband stayed seated for a moment, staring blankly ahead, his mind likely racing through the ruins of what had been his pride. He had believed money could bend the world to his will, but it had only exposed his emptiness. The mistress touched his arm again, this time with hesitation, but he didn't move. He couldn't look at her. The very presence that once made him feel powerful now filled him with bitterness. The wife stood, smoothing her clothes, her grace unwavering. As she walked past her husband, she didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence between them said everything. That love once existed but was destroyed by greed and deceit. That respect could not be demanded, only earned, and that truth, though delayed, had the final word. The husband turned slightly, watching her go, his eyes hollow with the realization that he had lost something far greater than wealth. The mistress followed a few steps behind him, her head down, her confidence gone. The image of them walking out together was no longer glamorous. It was tragic, the very picture of consequences earned. Outside the courtroom, the reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, questions flying. The wife paused for a moment, then simply said, "I just wanted fairness." Her voice was steady, calm, and every word carried the quiet authority of someone who had endured and overcome. She didn't elaborate, didn't attack, didn't celebrate. She walked away from the chaos with poise, her strength leaving an impression stronger than any statement could. Inside, the husband remained behind for a while, his world dismantled by his own arrogance. His empire, his image, his mistress, all of it had turned against him. The judgment had not just taken away his assets. It had stripped him of illusion, revealing the truth beneath the surface he had built so carefully. In the end, the wife left with her head high, the mistress left in silence, and the husband remained seated in the echo of his own downfall. The courtroom that had once witnessed his arrogance now stood as the place where justice had reclaimed its voice, and where the dignity of a woman he had underestimated was finally restored through the power of truth.